The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. And we say hello to Eric Blanc, who writes on labor movements past and present. Formerly a high school teacher in the Bay Area, he's also the author of Red State Revolt, The Teachers' Strike Wave and Working Class Politics. Eric Blanc, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
Our pleasure to have you with us. Among other things, this book offers a correction about how we think about red states and the often talked about red-blue divide. How is this wave of teacher strikes reshaping the way we understand red state politics?
Yeah, I think really this red state, blue state narrative is very superficial at best. And it's peddled both by Republicans to give themselves some sort of legitimacy, but also really by the Democratic Party establishment as an excuse to not take bold progressive action and to not really foreground demands on behalf of working class people. And the reality is that polls for years have shown that there's a progressive majority in all states of the country, not just on economic issues like Medicare for all, but even on social issues like immigration rights. And so what we're talking about when we look at these strikes is the expression of a sentiment that already existed but just wasn't given an outlet. Because if you have to choose between Republicans and corporate Democrats, a lot of people check out. Most people don't vote for Republicans in red states. They vote either for Democrats or they don't vote at all. That was the case across the board. But the strikes that we saw gave an outlet to really what is a very deep and legitimate anger against the way things have been going for decades in this country.
Now, as you have often noted in your journalism about teachers' strikes, these are not actions limited to issues such as teacher pay. These are strikes about the soul of education. Why is this so important?
Right. Well, for a long time, unions have been on the defensive, and part of the reason for that is that unlike these teacher strikes, the norm for unions has been to sort of act or be seen like a special interest just out for themselves. And so, as you mentioned, these weren't strikes just about pay, but in fact were strikes not just for the soul of education, but really on behalf of students and parents as well. So one of the crucial demands in almost all of the strikes was the call for more funding for schools. You had teachers go on strike in a place like Oklahoma or Los Angeles, not demanding any new pay for themselves. And they were solely fighting for things like more funding, more nurses, more counselors, smaller class sizes. And so they were able to push back against this narrative, which is so prevalent when there's strikes, not just in the public sector, but generally, that workers are just greedy and looking out for themselves. And they made it clear to the public that actually what this was about was providing better public services, both for workers and for parents and students as well. And they were really successful. The polls overwhelmingly showed that the public backed the strikes because of this.
Now, Eric, you spent a great deal of time on the picket line with striking teachers to do the research for this book. So who did you meet, and did anything surprise you about that experience?
Yeah, so I really did spend a lot of time in these strikes. I was in all of the major strikes since 2018. And one of the really surprising aspects was that even in red states, you did see that relatively small groups of organizers, often radicals, often people who got politicized through the Bernie Sanders campaign, who were very young, might have considered themselves socialists. They played this outsized influence. It's not as if the bulk of the strikers themselves shared their politics, but you did see this real dynamic where young teachers who had first gotten politicized through the Bernie Sanders campaign and maybe who are members of the Democratic Socialists of America played a leading role in places like West Virginia and Arizona. The West Virginia strike itself really began, the organizing for that began in a study group of the Democratic Socialists of America in Charleston in 2017, where teachers started studying what strikes had worked in the past. And you saw that again in Arizona. And it does really say something about, I think, this new moment and the new battle within the Democratic Party for what direction things should go, that you have these younger crew of radicals playing an important role in the strikes and in trying to shape the course of politics in their states.
And as you have alluded to before, when we're talking about the red-blue divide, it's not in just a red state or a blue state. It's in any state, in every state. You've written that many of the teachers you met were disillusioned with their unions as agents for meaningful change. Do unions deserve this lack of trust? And what's the message you hope unions will hear from these teachers?
Well, yeah, to a certain extent, the mistrust is deserved. I think that the reality is unions have been in decline for decades. And a big reason for that is that unions have turned away from some of the methods of organizing and politics that they relied on at their most successful, which is to say that for the last, 4 or 5 decades, unions have almost exclusively oriented towards lobbying the Democratic Party instead of building up their own independent power, instead of really putting forward an independent political perspective that can inspire and excite and involve educators or other workers. And so, yeah, the distrust is understandable because if the union's not delivering and if the union's not trying to get you involved, then it's understandable why people check out. But I think it would be a big mistake to look at the union somehow as this third party separate from the workers or the teachers, because one of the inspiring things about these strikes was that organizers on the ground made a case to other school workers that actually, rather than just complain about the union, people needed to understand that the union was them, that we are the union, and that the union was really only going to be as powerful and as effective as rank and file workers made it. And so that transformation of the union happened because people consciously started going to meetings, they consciously started challenging some of the old strategies, and they were largely successful in pushing the unions and the union leaderships into a new type of politics, a more confrontational politics with the bosses, with the corporations, with the politicians. And it worked, and we saw it work.
We're speaking with Eric Blanc, who writes on labor movements, past and present. He's also the author of Red State Revolt, The Teachers' Strike Wave, and Working Class Politics. Eric, in some ways, these strikes are very specific to the states in which they take place. To what extent do organizers communicate across state lines, and are they creating potential for a nationwide movement?
Yeah, clearly there are differences in the types of organizing that you're going to have to do in a place like Arizona, where there's no collective bargaining and you don't have the legal right to strike, compared to a place like California, where you do have these rights. And so the rhythms and the dynamics are distinct, but really what's at the core of all of these struggles is a fight to defend and improve public education. That's both for workers and for students. So there has been quite a bit of communication across state lines, and there's been a lot of cross-fertilization and inspiration. The West Virginia strike almost overnight evaporated the sense of powerlessness that has really seized working people and educators also across the country. People saw West Virginia strike and win in 2018, and that spread like a wildfire across the country, and it's continuing. And there has been active discussion between teachers in these different states. A lot of the organizing and communication has taken place over social media. You have these Facebook groups and Facebook chats. You have a lot of solidarity expressed through group photos where teachers in one state will take a photo with their coworkers in solidarity with strikers elsewhere. And then there's also been networks created, things like Labor Notes, which is a left-wing sort of network of educators and other working people across the country, where people can come together to talk about what's worked, what's not working, how can we support your struggle, what are the lessons being learned. So yeah, there's definitely a national movement, and we're starting to see some repercussions of that in the national discourse around public education, which is definitely shifting in the direction of the unions and strikers rather than the kind of corporate reformers who dominated the airwaves for such a long time.
Well, and there's also a narrative that often emerges when teachers strike that they're letting the kids down. And that speaks to the needs for teachers to win over the public. Have teachers in this recent wave of strikes been able to do that?
Yeah, definitely. So, as I mentioned before, part of the ability for them to do that so successfully was because they raised demands on behalf of students and on behalf of just improving public education generally. So there was that aspect. But they also took really proactive steps to do things like provide free lunches for students who depended on the free lunch that would normally, or breakfast actually even, that they normally would receive at school, because a lot of working class students in all of these states really were dependent and are dependent on schools to be able to eat every day. And so when you have a strike, it poses a real challenge for a lot of working class families, like both where do you house students and how are they going to get their nutrition. And so one of the things that the strikers did in a lot of the states is that they proactively started organizing child care centers, maybe in churches or in community centers, to be able to provide a space for students to go during the strike, and also to provide food and hand deliver them off. And so that parents knew that it was actually teachers were fighting on behalf of their students and weren't hurting them, contrary to what the media kept on saying. But, people saw in their own experience who was actually out there defending their students. And I think that's one of the reasons why the strikes are so successful.
Mm-hmm. Now, a continuing theme in your work on covering teachers is the evolution of privatization in education and the role of billionaires in shaping how we educate our kids. Are Democrats doing enough to challenge this trend and champion the public in public education?
I think the first thing that needs to be said there is that the Democratic Party has been just as complicit as the Republican Party for years in the corporate education reform. You actually had more charters created under the Obama administration, charter schools, which are privately run but publicly funded entities. You had more charters under Obama created than any administration before or since. And in fact, most privatization where it's gone furthest has been in blue states, not red states. So not only have Democrats not done enough generally to combat this trend, but in fact, they've often, and for the most part, unfortunately, been on the wrong side. That is starting to change now. There's definitely a shift where being openly pro-privatization and openly anti-teacher and anti-teacher union is no longer kosher in at least the mainstream of the Democratic Party. But it remains to be seen whether that type of rhetorical shift will be matched in action. And so you can kind of get some sense of the contradictions, because even in a place like California, which is a deep blue state in which there's a super majority of Democrats and it's completely run by Democrats, the pushes for things like a moratorium on charter schools for a fully public school system have been, for the most part, not implemented yet. There's been some steps forward, but despite these calls for a moratorium on charters, the actual action backing that up is still very limited. And on a national level, so far only Bernie Sanders has called for a national moratorium on charter schools. So I'm hoping that the strikes and Bernie's new plan for education will become the norm, but it remains to be seen whether it will be implemented in action.
And Eric, before we let you go, is there a playbook in this story that other workers can use? I mean, even those outside the public sector?
Yeah, I think there's two big points I would make. The first is strikes work. If we're going to take back this country and take on the billionaires, we need a strong labor movement. And the way you build a strong labor movement historically and still today is you need to be able to use the strike weapon. By withholding our labor, we're able to shut down any institution, any corporation. And if we don't lean on that type of tactic, we're not going to be able to reverse course for working people generally. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we need to challenge this narrative of scarcity, this idea that there's just not enough to go around, that there's not enough for public schools, there's not enough for quality health care, there's not enough to save our planet. And I think that the reality is, and the statistics demonstrate it, and the strikes have won the public to this, at least when it comes to education, that there is enough to go around. But the problem is that the billionaires and the corporations aren't paying their fair share. So in order to provide, a decent life for the majority of people in this country, it's possible, but it's going to require that the corporations and the rich, we have to reverse these decades of tax cuts to them, and we need to create a much more equitable prioritization of resources. But that's going to be a huge struggle because those in power don't like giving up their privilege in general. And so I do think that it's possible to change that narrative and to fight back, but it's going to take a lot more organizing. Hopefully, though, the strikes are just a first inkling of what we can see more broadly amongst working people.
Yeah, amen to that. Eric Blanc writes on labor movements, formerly high school teacher in the Bay Area, and he's the author of Red State Revolt, The Teachers' Strike Wave, and Working Class Politics, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Eric, thank you so much for your time. We look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Great. Thanks for having me.
And we appreciate your time. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
I never dreamed of growing up to be a political activist commentator, but here I am, and it worked out pretty well for me. I've been lucky enough to have a voice in public matters and eke out a modest living running my mouth as an independent populist agitator. Still, I have to confess to the sin of job envy, not in the sense of being resentful, but regretful about my own inability to lift the trade of journalistic commentary to the heights attained by a small, feisty collection of unique public opinionators, political cartoonists. In framing issues and rallying people to think and act, these journalists have an unfair advantage over us mere word crafters. They can literally draw a picture to make their point. They reach masses viscerally as well as cerebrally, and visceral usually outpunches cerebral. Editorial cartooning is a profession made up largely of progressive mavericks who enter the social, political, cultural fray with an abundance of anti-establishment audacity, an eye for irony, fondness for the underdog, and an ability to laugh at absurdity, plus artistic talent. Because cartooning is an expression of the human spirit that's been irrepressible since cave drawings, generation after generation of pen and ink champions of democracy blossomed. The general public's appreciation and demand for the cartoonist's unblinking honesty and satire have never flagged, even increasing whenever the artists come under public assault by autocrats, plutocrats, screwballs, and assorted other censors. These graphic editorial artists matter. Again and again, they've roused the public to rise up and put down corporate and political scoundrels, incrementally advancing our nation's democratic possibilities. As in the natural world, though, even the most beneficial creatures can be driven to extinction. This is Jim Hightower saying, check your own local newspaper. Are your favorite cartoonists still there?
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. And we say hello to Jeff Bryant. He's director of the Education Opportunity Network, an education project of People's Action. Jeff Bryant, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Our pleasure to have you with us. In a recent post, you wrote of an education wave that could inspire new candidates and votes. So what is the education wave, and how does it differ from the much-hoped-for blue wave?
The education wave is the popular uprising we're seeing coming from teachers and other educators. It started with the school walkouts that occurred earlier this year in red states like West Virginia, Kentucky, Arizona, Oklahoma, when teachers just said, we're walking out of school. We can't teach under these conditions anymore until you provide us with what we need, which was a range of things, including better salaries and health care, and especially better resources for the students, smaller class sizes, repairs to school buildings, things like that. And each of those walkouts had various success rates. Some teachers got more than what they want, not as much as what they wanted. Some were more successful than others. But what it also inspired a lot of teachers to do, because they showed such unity, is that many of them decided to run for office. They wanted to challenge these lawmakers in electoral contests. Some of the particularly Republican lawmakers were insulting to the teachers. They tried to dismiss all of their claims as being untruthful or unnecessary. And so the teachers said, well, we're going to take you on. Their slogan became, we'll remember in November. And so now we've got an unprecedented number of teachers, both current and former teachers, and also other educators, principals, administrators, what have you, who've decided to run for office. And many of them are being very successful.
And Jeff, you write about the remarkable number of educators running for office. I've seen numbers as high as 550, and that's anything from a Board of Education all the way up to state Senate seats and that kind of thing. What are the driving factors, other than some of the things you mentioned, that would get them to take that step? Because it's a big step going from educator to running for office. Yes,
many of these people are running for office for the first time, and they're not connected to big money, so it's a real challenge for them. That 550 number that you tossed out is kind of a low ball, really. It's hard to get an exact count of how many educators are running for office. The 550 number comes from the National Education Association. It's 550 of their members who are running for office. I saw a number the other day reported by the Associated Press. It was coming from the Democratic Legislation Campaign Committee. That they counted 650 educators running just for state legislature. So I think it's safe to say that there are many hundreds of educators who've decided to take up the cause. And the things that they want, it's pretty hard to generalize completely about them, but it's certainly a theme that occurs in almost every one of their campaigns, is better funding for schools. It's important to remember that these candidates are not all Democrats. That's how it differs from the blue wave. According to the DLCC tally of 650, there were 480 who were running as Democrats, and the rest are running as Republicans or independents. But even the Republicans candidates are saying, we want better funding for schools. We've had too many years of austerity. It's crippling to the children. It's hard on us. It makes it very difficult to do our job, and it's time for that to end. But the other thing that is creeping into the campaigns is certainly that we want better funding and better support for public schools. Under the era of Betsy DeVos that we're now in, the U.S. Secretary of Education, where there's a lot of emphasis on so-called school choice, options other than public schools, such as charter schools or private schools that are funded by vouchers. We've seen a lot of money pulled out of public schools and sent to these other alternatives. And many of these candidates are saying that we have to take a pause and think about what we're doing there, either ending some of these programs or definitely putting them on a moratorium or giving them stricter regulations, because a lot of that money is just siphoned into private pockets instead of into classroom instruction. In other places, some educators are more incensed about the tone of local government, the Trump effect, if you will, of how authoritarian politicians have become, how dismissive they are of particularly women who work hard in the public sector, and how anti-union many of these politicians are. They want to see that change too. It's not to say that this educator wave is an anti-Trump wave. I wouldn't put it that way. As I said, some of them who are running for office are Republicans and indeed voted for Trump. But what it is, it's a populist wave, much like the what we've seen in elections in the Democratic Party, where a new form of populism is coming up from the ground up and saying, we want change and we want it driven by what the common people want and not what the policy leaders have been saying for years.
Mm-hmm. Now, thinking about specific races and regions, where do you see the potential of education as an issue and educators as candidates to make an impact on November 6th?
One election that stands out to me is the current election for governor in Arizona. We have an educator. His name is David Garcia, running on the Democratic side. He is a former associate state superintendent in the state. He's a college professor. He's taking on the incumbent Doug Ducey. Arizona is one of these states that people have been saying for years would trend blue, but yet Trump won Arizona fairly handily. But Garcia is taking a very pro-education stance in his campaign, and it's obviously working well for him. The election is a toss-up currently. At least that's the way I've seen it in the latest polls. Another election where you see education very prominent is the governor's race in Florida, where Andrew Gillum is going after his opponent DeSantis on the Republican side with a call to let's fund education better. DeSantis, as the Republican candidate, is very pro-Trump, a Tea Party type, and Gillum said it's time to end that kind of austerity. We need to. He wants to increase education funding by $1 billion. Another governor's race where education is prominent is Stacy Abrams, the Democratic candidate in Georgia. She's campaigning against a voucher program in that state that steers money away from public schools. In terms of regional action, there are so many educators who are running in Oklahoma and Kentucky and West Virginia. That'll be very interesting to see how many of them are going to be successful. The majority of them, the last count I saw was 70-something%, won their primaries or advanced without having a primary contest. So their track record is remarkably good. And it's not just in the red states where this is happening too. Well, we also have Wisconsin, which is what I'd call a purple state. It's had, though, a Republican governor for years, Scott Walker. There's an educator competing against him for governor, Tony Evers. And Evers is making a big point of better salary for teachers and also a cap on the state's voucher program, which Scott Walker expanded statewide. Last poll I saw, Evers was up. So there are many places where educators are leading and education is leading as an issue.
We're speaking with Jeff Bryant, director of the Education Opportunity Network, an education project of People's Action. Jeff, in another post you wrote, you suggest another possibility after midterms, that progressive candidates may end the funding versus accountability war. Explain to us the battle lines of that war and how it may shift.
This is a war that goes way back. For years, I would say at least 30, 40 years, Republicans have made the argument that it's useless to put more money into education because educators aren't accountable, quote unquote, accountable. And that's kind of a very vague way to describe somebody's job. What are you accountable for? What is a teacher accountable for? Well, what the Republicans decided that they were accountable for is improving test scores. And that argument caught on with the Clinton administration, Bill Clinton administration in the 90s, where he also took up that banner and said, okay, we'll fight for funding for teachers because we're the Democratic Party, but we also agree with Republicans that they need to be made more accountable. And that argument became basically the law of the land. It was it was finally enshrined into federal statutes in the George W. Bush administration under federal policy called No Child Left Behind that required every state to test all their students in reading and math, and then there were consequences if the scores didn't improve. That policy was continued under Barack Obama. But teachers for years have been saying it's unfair because, first of all, the correlation of test scores to poverty is extremely high. And almost every time you see a school that has low test scores, you can just make a ballpark assumption about the demographics of the students. There are exceptions for sure, but it's just a statistical universality that test scores are going to be very correlative to the demographics of the students. If the kids live in poverty or they don't speak the language well, they tend not to do as well on the tests. And we've got now a majority non-white student population. About half the students live in poverty. Teachers are pointing out that their conditions are harder at home, so it makes the job of teaching tougher when the kids come to school. Also, we've had this horrible financial austerity. We've had class size increases, which makes teachers' jobs harder. And all those have an impact on test scores. And teachers have been saying, look, we can't have this trade-off anymore. It's unfair. You can't keep telling us we're not accountable for these test scores while you're robbing us of our funding and you're not doing anything to improve our situation. I think that point is starting to get across. And it's not getting across to people, and including politicians, because of some kind of new statistical report or some kind of breakthrough idea. It's getting across because what teachers have finally been able to get into the media about their work. That was what was so remarkable about the teacher walkouts this spring, is that teachers used their own voices and their own experiences to explain the conditions in schools. They didn't use statistics and test scores and things that don't really move people. They got onto social media and showed videos of what their classrooms look like and what the textbooks they have to use in school look like. That really moved people. And you can see it now in these candidates who I've just mentioned and others who are taking up that cause because they've now seen that the population is changing now. They're starting to get it, that the problems with our school systems are not the lack of accountability, they're the lack of support.
If educators do win in November, do you see them as allies on progressive issues other than education?
That's a very good question and hard to ascertain right now. Most of the educators that whose campaigns I've looked at, they're very much running on education. Now, there are exceptions. Some of them are also especially talking about healthcare issues. But many of these candidates, they've made education their banner. But the thing that's important to realize about educators is that they tend to have a progressive mindset for a number of reasons. First of all, they believe that people can grow and change and learn and stretch their capacities. That's a progressive idea. But also, the way that our society has been going over the past 2-3 decades is that we've turned educators really into first responders to children, to their needs. Because as we've pulled away all these other programs, you think about welfare, job assistance, healthcare, all these housing, all of these programs that have been constricted due to financial austerity. What happens is all the children that experience those things, the lack of housing, the lack of adequate nutrition, the problems with opioid addiction, they bring that to school. The teachers see it firsthand. And so we've made teachers these firsthand responders. And so they're the ones that know what's going on in our communities. And that would make them very likely to be progressive allies, especially on issues of healthcare and the needs of children. Also, teachers are 78%, I think I got that figure about right, female. So teachers are going to be generally aligning with progressives on women's rights. And that's certainly going to be what I'm looking forward to seeing after the election, is having more educators as lawmakers who can bring their voices into these arguments and fortify what progressives are already saying.
Certainly, yeah. And quite frankly, long overdue. Jeff Bryant, director of the Education Opportunity Network, which is an education project of People's Action, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Jeff, we appreciate your time with us today and look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Thanks for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
We were all stunned over the weekend by this mass murder up in Buffalo. Young killer, inspired, as he says, by what's called the Great Replacement Theory. You dive into that in the Monday edition of Popular Information. It's been around a long time. Tell us, what's it all about and where'd it come from?
Yeah, this is something that's been circulating for decades. It has its root deeply in racism, prejudice, anti-Semitism. And the idea is that there is a plot. Sometimes it's by Jews. More recently, it's by Democrats, but also Jews. And the idea is that they are plotting to replace white people with non-white people as a way to achieve political power. And this was something that was promoted in the 40s here in the United States by a United States senator, by others, and then kind of was revived in the 70s and 80s in France, really in response to migration and the trends of migration in Europe through a very racist novel called The Camp of Saints, and also some French philosophers who latched onto it. And then more recently, of course, it's been imported into United States politics. We saw it probably most vividly in 2017 in Charlottesville when the white supremacist marchers were chanting, "You will not replace us." So and that should have been a warning sign right there.
Or the other version of it, the Jews will not replace us, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. But then what we've really seen since then, it's been about 5 years since then, is really the mainstreaming of this. And that's what I talked about mostly in today's newsletter was, the mainstreaming. There's been a lot written about Tucker Carlson. There was a New York Times expose on what his show is all about. He's referenced this over 400 times. When the ADL called him out, he rejected that, doubled down on it. But, and I think Carlson's played a big part of this, it has really been incorporated into lots of what would ordinarily be considered mainstream Republican voices who have adopted this rhetoric.
Right.
And it's become somewhat ubiquitous, all the way to the point where almost 50% of Republicans actually believe this replacement theory, which started off as a fringe white nationalist conspiracy theory, is now accepted by almost 50% of Republicans. So it's a very troubling trend.
Right. I mean, we remember the crazy Steve King from Iowa, right? Was kind of an exponent of this. But he was out there, as you point out, on the fringe, right? The extreme right. I mean, now it's come into the mainstream. And in your newsletter, you identify leading Republicans who have espoused this theory publicly, including Ron Johnson, right, from Wisconsin, Matt Gaetz from Florida, and even Elise Stefanik from New York, who's the third-ranking House Republican. And they say this stuff and get away with it, right?
Yeah, it's really a rebranding of this kind of racial grievance, which was the purpose of the theory all along. And they're very unapologetic about it, even in the face. You know, one thing that actually shocked me as I was looking into this is even after the shooting, you have Blake Masters, who's running for Senate in Arizona with $10 million from billionaire Peter Thiel, who's pushing the replacement theory after the shooting. So there isn't really much soul searching going on. There's not a lot of introspection. They're continuing to latch onto this. By the way, we also know how this theory leads to violence, because whether it's El Paso, the shooting in New Zealand, the mass shooting there, this has been cited repeatedly by mass shooters as the motivation for violence, which was part of the point when the ADL confronted Tucker Carlson about this.
Right. And so I was going to ask you, what influence or impact do you think Fox News has had in the spreading of this theory, this doctrine, or whatever you want to call it? It's Tucker, but not just Tucker, correct?
Yeah, it's Tucker, but it's also, I think Laura Ingraham plays a big part. She was in the piece that I wrote this morning, talking about how Democrats want to replace you, the American voters, with new immigrants who aren't like you. So I think Laura Ingraham, Jeanine Pirro, it's really been incorporated. Tucker Carlson, I think Laura Ingraham probably was on this before Tucker Carlson, to be honest. But I think Tucker Carlson has taken such a big stage in Fox News that he's pushing it, and it gets incorporated, throughout all their programming.
How about the role of Donald Trump, who certainly, while on one side he at some point condemned white supremacism, at the same time he was welcoming their support, right? And kind of looking the other way.
Yeah, I think Trump was really at the vanguard of this. He has been possibly slightly less direct in using the replacement rhetoric, but he set the stage for this, talking about immigration as an issue of survival for the West, meaning that if you allow immigrants in, your entire culture and nation will be destroyed. I mean, that was really the basis of his campaign and his presidency. Then he brought in Stephen Miller, who was a big proponent of the racist novel that really encapsulates this whole theory, The Camp of the Saints. Steve Bannon, same thing, brought Steve Bannon in, and they really started to basically take this theory and translate it into executive action with the Muslim ban, and with other very restrictive immigration policies, child separation, all of this, it doesn't make sense, but there's a logic to, if you believe that this is an invasion, that there is a plot to take over the country, and that it's going to destroy the country because somehow the country is based on this idea of a white majority, well, then these very extreme steps start to make sense. So I do think that Trump played a large role.
One thing I find I think some people find hard to connect is, and as you point out, in France, this was related to immigrants from North Africa, particularly Muslims. In this country, it was directed a lot toward, particularly because of Stephen Miller and Steve Bannon and Donald Trump, toward immigrants from Latin America. Yet the target in Buffalo were African Americans, were Black Americans. What's the stretch there? What's the link?
Well, because I think from the outset, it's been about the preservation of whiteness and of the white majority. So both non-white immigrants but also African Americans themselves pose a threat to that. And they're related in a way. And Tucker Carlson actually talked about this with the Immigration Act of 1964, which he described as one of the worst attacks on America in our history. And what that did was it relaxed some of these very severe immigration quotas that were largely based on race, that ensured that immigrants were largely white people from Northern and Western Europe.
Yeah.
After the Immigration Act of 1964, you started to see more immigration from Asia, from Africa, from South America, where not all of the immigrants were white. So it does play out in different ways, but I think there is a fundamental connection around white identity, and that's why it's a conspiracy theory that's associated with white nationalism.
Right. So one other big issue dominating the news for the last 10 days or so has been the Supreme Court and the leak of this opinion by Justice Alito indicating that the court, they've got enough votes, Clarence Thomas and Alito and three others, to overturn Roe v. Wade. In your newsletter, Judd, you talk about an aspect of this that I don't think anybody else has, and that is the amazing amount of support that American corporations have provided to anti-abortion political committees. I mean, there is a money-driven political side to this issue that is pretty stunning. What'd you find out?
Yeah, well, a lot of this is about looking at where the big corporate dollars are spent. And one of the things that I do, in my newsletter, but I think it's also endemic of a lot of the coverage, is we're looking at this money that's spent directly with candidates, because that's what's up front. That's what we see.
Yeah.
But those contributions are pretty limited, 5,000, 10,000 a cycle. There are these 527 committees, the Republican Governors Association, the Republican State Leadership Committee. These are the groups that have been working systematically year after year after year to put Republicans in control of the state legislatures and governors. And there you see corporations spending millions of dollars. We just looked at 13 corporations only since 2016, and we found that those 13 corporations had spent $15 million just on these major committees that are principally responsible for installing anti-abortion politicians at the state level and the federal level. Because it obviously there's been a lot of focus on the Supreme Court. That's obviously extremely important, and they're about to, it appears, overturn a constitutional right. But the impact of this is because you have Republican legislatures paired up with a Republican governor who are passing these very extreme abortion bans, and they have these trigger laws in place that will snap into effect when Roe's overturned. And that's the work of these committees that really made that possible. And that's where the corporations and that corporate money is so important.
So I have the list in front of me. And just to share with our listeners here on the Bill Press Pod, I think they may be surprised to hear some of the ones that you identified. Again, these are contributions to these three committees: the Republican Senate Committee, the Republican Governors Association, and the Republican State Leadership, which is state legislative races, right?
That's right.
So we're talking Amazon, $974,000 plus. CVS, $1.4 million. AT&T, $1.4 million. You're not surprised at Walmart, but CVS and Amazon, General Motors, $2.4 million. I mean, these are very highly respected kind of mainstream American corporations. You don't think of them as having a right-wing agenda, but
yeah, that's right. And what I think we've seen is the Republican Party on a lot of these issues, abortion being one of them, has become radicalized, and corporations have not changed their giving habits.
Right. Yeah.
And so they're continuing to do it. And one thing that's important about most of this money, not the money that's given to the National Republican Senatorial Committee, but the governors and the state legislative races, this isn't normally for federal spending. It has to be voluntary contributions from employees. They go into a PAC, and then the company kind of doles them out. So you don't have to participate if you don't want to. This money that's going to the Republican Governors Association and the State Legislative Committee, these 6-figure, 7-figure donations, that's directly from corporate treasuries. So that's money that is coming directly from the corporation to these. So it's quite significant in that respect.
And don't some of these companies at the same time have a policy that says, oh, we respect our employees, we take care of our women employees especially, and we're concerned about their health care. And at the same time, they're giving this money away to anti-abortion committees.
Yeah, Amazon, I think, is a perfect example. Its CEO, Andy Jassy, came out with a statement saying, a while ago, saying the company's committed to gender equality and empowerment in the workplace and in communities. And even after, or I think it was announced the same day as the decision came out, so it may have kind of been anticipating this, Amazon is saying they will pay for their employees to travel to out of state to get an abortion if they need to, which is fine. I don't think it's a systemic solution to the issue, but it's fine. But at the same time, they are funding the politicians that make these abortion bans possible. So I do think that there's a lot of hypocrisy around the rhetoric that these corporations use because they're not matching that with their political donations. Their political donations are going the other way.
And it's also true, isn't it, that these are the same, the people that these committees are supporting, if they're responsible at the state level for laws that would ban abortion in their states, they're also responsible for the ones that would suppress voting rights, right? Which may attack the LGBT community, all kinds of repressive state laws.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think if anything, the Republican State Legislative Committee, they support anti-abortion candidates. They don't, and they've been critical in putting them in office. They don't talk about that issue that much, but they're very vocal on, especially since 2020, on restricting voting. They've supported all sorts of voting restriction measures. They had a committee there. They actually were constructing a lot of the legislative language that got put in. So they're extremely active in voter suppression legislation and also anti-LGBTQ legislation as well.
All right. Now, we're talking about corporate money. I remember right after January 6th, there were dozens of corporations that said, oh, man, this is important. We are not going to give any more money to any of those Republicans who voted to overturn the election on the evening of January 6th, of whom there were 100, as we know, right, 139 Republicans in the House and 8 Republican senators. How carefully are these corporations sticking to that promise, Judd?
Well, that's something we spend a lot of time with, Bill.
I know.
So we've been tracking that really for the last year and a half, almost year and a half now.
And I'm glad you have been.
Yeah.
So.
and I'll say that it's a situation that's continuing to get less and less. Continuing to feel less and less optimism that these pledges will have any staying power.
Some of them have actually reversed, right?
Yes. There are a few dozen companies that have maintained their pledges, and so I don't think we should overlook that, because that is something that is significant. But you do have a number of companies that were very vocal after January 6th about how the members of Congress who made this vote that's not consistent with their values, they're cutting off donations to those folks. AT&T was one of those. Cigna was one of those. Comcast, Eli Lilly, General Electric, all of those fall into that category, and then have subsequently reversed and started donating both to individual members who voted to overturn the election on January 6th, and then also the committees like the NRCC, the Republican House Committee, that's supporting everyone who voted to overturn the election collectively. So there are a number of companies that have backslid on that. What's interesting is not really much has changed. It's not, you might be able to understand it more if the people who voted against the election results, against certifying the election results, then subsequently said, you know what, now that it's been a year and Trump is still going around claiming the election was stolen, like that was really a mistake, I would never do that again. No one is saying that. Everyone is standing by their vote, but it's just the corporations that are changing their policies.
If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.